Okay, let me see. Okay. Oh, okay. I'm going to go ahead and get us started, and I'm sure we'll have some other people join us. Maybe not. I hope they view today. Let's go over to, if you haven't logged into Canvas, and we're going to talk about where we are at this stage of the game. And we passed the magical module 7. Now we're at module 8. And we have, no. I'm a week behind as always. This whole semester been a week behind. All right. Now, this week, we're going to look at two cases. One of them is this naive Bayes, which is from the Foreman text, and the Foreman text is the data smart text. And then we're also going to look at some queuing theory using the single arbitrary model, and we'll talk about it as well. Now, I have for everybody here some resources that are directly related to these cases, primarily to the case from the data smart. And what we're going to do in the naive Bayes case, and that's at Mandrill in the Foreman text, is we're going to take some tweets, and we're going to take one set of tweets that we know are about this company. And remember, this guy was the CIO at MailChimp, which is a mail email service. And we're going to take a set of tweets, I think 150 of them, that are about the company that we know are, and then we're going to take 150 that we're not sure of or we know they are not about the company, and we're going to build a predictive model. Now, the reason I'm having us do this is so that you get a sense of some of the stuff that we have to do with what we call big data. And you're going to hear that, and you'll have people make references to that all the time. And big data is really nothing than data that does not necessarily lend itself easily to a table. And it can be anything. What we're going to look at are tweets, but it could be scraping data off of Facebook pages, comments. It could be Yelp it could be locational data. It could be Amazon reviews. That there's such a variety of it, and as we see more and more mobile computing and more stuff on the cloud and faster computing, these unstructured data are and how we handle them are going to become a very, very crucial situation. Here we're going to use a model out of probability, Bayesian probability, to build a model that helps us identify whether or not a tweet is about our company. Now, this is pretty much standard stuff for the people at MailChimp, for the simple reason that as an email service, one of the first things they do is they work with the client to help them determine what should go into spam, what should be allowed through the filters for security purposes, but also just simply for sanity purposes. And if you're like me, you probably have 2 or 3 email accounts that are filled with stuff. And being responsible people like me, you probably feel guilty if you see the same email that's been sitting there for 3 weeks. You know, I've got to answer it or do something. So MailChimp provides a service to help companies keep their people productive instead of messing around with answering a bunch of stuff, or the phishing email that comes in and tells you to click on a link or send money to Nigeria or something like that. Now, the text is just absolutely the guy that's put this text together. He's just as smart as he could be, and he's going to show us how we can do this by utilizing some of the functions in Microsoft Excel. So that's why I have all of these PDFs here for you, okay? And I also have, as a faith integration thing, a link there that talks about the case for the resurrection of Jesus, the probabilities, and I've sat and looked at the scripture, and I've done it both ways, as dependent events or independent events. In either way, what Paul says in his account, 2 saw him, 12 saw him, and then ending up with several hundred people at once saw him, ought to be a message. It's interesting to me that in a scientific age that you could sit down and show this to someone, that passage of scripture, and they still would not believe. But yet they will take on faith a lot of other kinds of probabilistic data. So we're going to be using but it's a form of what's known as naive Bayes. And what it really boils down to is that when we do the probabilistic estimates or forecasts, we operate on the assumption that there's a 50-50 chance, as opposed to some type of weighted or balanced kind of probability of events. And you'll see that, and we're going to also look at, and I have some explanations of some of the functions that we'll use. So there's a whole lot there, and I wanted you to see that so that when you encounter people out there who use those terms and they talk about the analytics, all that, we're just seeing a total revolution in business in terms of the data that we get and how do we use it and what do we do with it. So it's an excellent experience for us to look at this stuff. Now let me go over here to the home, and I'll get and we'll get the this is the Data Smart text, and we've done the cluster analysis. This is chapter 3. Now I want to say this: he's a young guy, and there are times when he jokes around, uses humor, and so he can spend a page or two just kind of telling you a funny joke about probabilities. And so bear with that. And there's some other stuff in here. One case, you want to take it with a grain of salt. But the technique that he's going to have walk us through is one of those techniques that's out there that people use that doesn't make statisticians happy, but seems to have a cachet that works out in the real world. So we'll be taking a look at that. And the file that you will use for that case is going to be over here. I'll just go to the files for a second. It's called Mandrill. And we'll go over to the files, and you'll see in the files section there the Foreman files. Okay, there they are, that zip file. And you'll want to download it. And then there's the case Mandrill. Now, what I'm going to do, and let me put that show in the folder, and then I'll pop this over. Now, you little weasel. Well, we'll open it and save it, I guess. There we go. Make me do that. Put it on my desktop. And are you gonna let me save you or not? Boy, you're not being very nice today. All righty, hang on a minute. All right. Yeah, let's see, open when done. And there they are. Now, I'm kind of putzing around with this, I apologize, but I'm going to take those Foreman files, I'm going to open it up, and it's going to be chapter 3. Well, here's the Mandrill file itself. So you'll want to download that. You can open it and then download it, okay? And I'll talk real briefly about it, then we'll take a look at the other case that we're going to work with. This is interesting as we kind of follow along with that. Now, let me move this up here for a moment. And I'm just going to walk you through the tabs so you start to kind of get a flavor. Then we'll talk about this. We also have that case single arbitrary, which is out of the big textbook, the Anderson text. And single arbitrary deals with queuing theory, waiting line theory, which is going to be extremely valuable for you to see and to get a taste of it. And we're going to look at probably one of the more basic models of that. Now, I'm going to go ahead and enable editing on this, and this is what you'll want to save it to the desktop and then upload it for the credit. But I'm just going to give you a quick kind of little run through what we're seeing here. Okay, these are a series of apps. Okay, and we have, I think, 150 of them. They're about Mandrill. Mandrill is one of the apps that MailChimp has, and he gets off about talking about mandrills, which are a certain type of ape, if I'm not mistaken. And so we have 150 of these, and as you can see, they're tweets. And then we have a tab that are their set of tweets about the other. Now, what we're going to do here, and the reason that this is a good case for you, and you'll get a lot from it, is you're gonna find that we're gonna spend 99.9% of our time simply cleaning up the data. And data science is, well, the folks over in the hard sciences tend to use R programming, and then there's some people now that use Python to do some work. But the bottom line is this: we take data and we clean them up, so we can do something with them that's meaningful. And we're going to see this as we see how he uses these. Then he has some app tokens, okay, and he's going to use some positioning. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take these tweets, or tokens as he's going to call them, and we're going to reduce them down to identifiable elements. So one of the key things that you do in data science, and this isn't a course about that or about big data, but you need to kind of have a feeling for it at the very least. What we do is we take that data and we get rid of the noise. You know, all data have signal and noise. The signal is the real story being told by a number or set of numbers. The noise is the variability that's there, that's introduced because we live in a fallen world, and a fallen world has random events and noise. So we're going to be doing that. Now, we'll be using some functions out of Excel to clean it up, okay? And there in Chapter 3, he walks you through that process of how we're going to do that and how we'll end up with our predictive test. Now, here are the other tokens, okay? And you can see he's got length in there and space positioning. And I'll explain that to you. Then we get the app token probabilities, and the probability that, you know, these words or phrases would indeed show up in a tweet if it's not about our product. Then he has the other tokens. And what we're doing here is what's known as an ex post facto study. It's like ex post facto is Latin for after the fact. And what we do is it's kind of like a post-mortem. When somebody's died, you know, the medical examiner will take a look at them. If they're in a hospital and they died, they'll have a review board, and they'll try to figure out, you know, what happened. Why did the person die? And if it's outside of out of a medical situation, somebody's killed in a car wreck or whatever, the medical examiner is going to go through and say, okay, here are the things that happened, so they can stitch together some of the events that might have occurred, or was the person murdered or not, that type of thing. So we do ex post facto. Now, there are a lot of studies out there in many, many fields of management where we'll take data that we know something happened, and we'll try to look backwards to see if we can find some clues, some things that were signals about what was going to happen. So we're doing that, and we're going to use that predictive model, the naive Bayes, and apply it to these data. Now here, and then we have some test tweets, okay, and then we have some test predictions, and we're going to try to predict whether or not whether or not a tweet is about their product or it is not about their product. It's something other. So you'll want to follow along, and the key thing, and let me bring this down for just a second, is to make certain that is to make certain that you follow along in the text. And I've excerpted some things from the text. Now, as is the mandrill, and he also walks us through a nice And chapter 3 is good because it's a nice little bit of a refresher on probability theory. And he walks you through the whole process of determining conditional probabilities, etc. And so you'll want to take a look at that. And then the chain rule and independent versus dependent events, which are handled completely differently. And then he gives us this, for example, here are the dependent situations. And then he walks us through to Bayes' rule. And Bayes' rule is very simple. It says we just naively assume, that's what's called naive Bayes. We naively assume that an event, say someone writing a tweet, there's a 50-50 chance it was about Mandrill or it was not about Mandrill. Or if we use naive Bayes to try to identify, they utilized naive Bayes when they tried to identify that flight, that Malaysian flight that just disappeared. And they just said, okay, here we have this, where we had the last radio signal, and we're just going to assume there's a 50-50 chance that they're somewhere in that area, rather than trying to attach conditional weighted probabilities, okay? And so it's a nice shortcut for people, especially those who work out in the real world. And I think he mentions a couple of resources, and there's some others out there that you'll want to take a look at. And he walks us through that theorem of using Bayes' rule. And then you could see he starts to work from the issue of the tweets and pulling them down. And so this is really good stuff for you. And the reason I use this book now, I've incorporated it, is because it covers it covers some things out there that are going on in what people call data science that the typical manager probably will not run into. But I don't think I think it's going to become I think it's just going to continue to be one of these things where it has so much information that we can't ignore using it. And so if I'm wanting to get, for example, consumer sentiment about my product or service, I'm going to go to Amazon. If I sell it there, I'm going to go to the place I sell it. I'm going to look at also social media, and anywhere else that I can get some type of information that tells me how people feel about it. That might be tweets, etc. It might be comments on Facebook. It might be comments about a restaurant where you've eaten or anything like that. And this is just because the data are there, they need to be harvested and worked with. And you'll encounter people down the road who are data scientists, and their job is nothing but to take these data that are so hard, clean them up, and put them into a position where we can use them. Now here, as I said before, we talk about that the probabilities are often assumed to be equal, okay? And he gives us some more information, and then he talks about dealing with rare words and identifying those, which would be what we would call an outlier. He does a little bit of grousing about how many zeros you can take on the floating point on Excel, and he complains about that a little bit, which is for those. And then he starts to walk us through, and we're going to be using that Mandrill XLSX, and he starts to walk us through, okay, the prep data. Now, I'm going to diminish this, okay, and go back here for a moment, and I want to talk some about how we prep that data. And what I might do is I'd say, take a look at the chapter dealing with single arbitrary. That's going to be the queuing theory, and we may just spend some time on this today, the majority of the time. If you take a look, and I'm in the Mandrill Excel file, and I'm over at the very first tab. And this tab, these are tweets that are about the product, okay? Now I'm going to scroll all the way up. We have 150 of those, if I'm not mistaken, that are about the product, okay? And then we have 150 that are not. And now we have just raw data, excuse me. And this is the tweet, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to reduce this down to the essential elements. In other words, we're going to strip the noise out to find the signal. And we're going to do that in a number of ways. And so we're going to start first over here in column B, and we're going to use lowercase. And so you can click on that in the insert. And what this does is this will take any text, okay, and it'll convert it to lowercase. We're after as pure and simple rare words or keywords, if you will, or what we call tokens as we can get. Okay, this is conceptually, it's pretty easy to understand. What it makes this guy a genius is he went in Excel and he took the existing kinds of functions in there and he's pretty much doing what other people would have to write a whole bunch of programming to do and all this. So you'll find Excel's a little bit better tool than maybe you'll hear sometimes. So we've got that, and let me go back up here to that first one, okay? And we use the lowercase. Now we're going to come back here to C, and in this case, we're going to substitute. I'll click on that. We're going to use the substitute function. And we're going to take that, and we're going to convert it into, we're going to get rid of any periods, and you'll see that we have the empty space. So we're starting to get rid of some punctuation. So we put everything to lowercase, all right? Then we start working on some things like punctuation that don't really belong. And then here we see another, and in this time with the substitute, we're getting rid of the semicolon and commas. And he walks you through this in the narrative in the book narrative. And let me pop this up just a bit more so it's probably a little bit easier to see, if it will. There we go. And you can see, I'll just take it back down to 100 because I'm not comfortable with this. But you can see here, I'll click on the dialog box. Here we're looking for a particular text string, okay? And we have the old text, and we're going to change it to a new text. And here we're going to leave a blank space. We're cleaning these up so we get them down to their essential element, okay? Now, when you took statistics, you went through some exercises where you computed one of two or maybe both things. You looked at measures of dispersion, like the range, okay, which is the highest, versus the lowest. You looked at measures of central tendency. For example, the mode, which is the most frequently occurring observation or score or number or whatever. And then we have things like standard deviation, which is exactly what it says it is. How standard do things change or do they deviate? So here we're doing that same process, but we're using these functions to just get rid of extraneous data, or what we think is extraneous data. And that's about 95% of the work that we do, so that we can get everything down to its complete essence, down to its essence. Now, I use these not because I believe you're going to go out and do this, but I want you to see the techniques and understand them and why we would grab them and use them. And again, when you hear people talk about unstructured data, big data, you're really talking about every kind of imaginable thing that's out there that we can pull and take a look at. Now, about 5 years ago, which I haven't had the time to follow up on it, I took a set of prospectuses that were SEC stock offerings. They were IPO prospectuses, and I know that the SEC makes everybody who does a prospectus for an IPO, everything is uniform in terms of the structure of what's supposed to be there. So I had that animal. And I took firms or companies that were purely ground-based. That's what they were, versus what I would call pure play digital types of firms. And I looked at their use of intellectual capital and compared them, and I had to pull a lot of stuff out and clean it up like this to see if firms that were digital, they were digitally based, were going to be more concerned about particular types of intellectual capital versus firms that were supposedly ground-based. And for example, I had anticipated that I would find, for example, firms are digital, I'd find a lot of mention about intellectual property, like licenses, patents, lists, things that have real value, versus ground-based that I wasn't sure what I would, but I figured I'd hear some things, see some things like employee training, technology that they own, that type of thing. I was pretty shocked when I found out that the so-called ground-based and the digital looked a lot alike. But if you go and you look at, if we were taking this class with me 30 years ago, the Fortune 500, most of their assets were tangible assets, stuff they had or they owned. Today, it's flipped itself. 80% of the value of most of the companies on the Fortune 500 or those traded on Wall Street that are non-tangible capital. Google, their algorithms. Apple, their design, their logo. These are not physical things or things that are created in somebody's mind. And so the whole market has completely changed as we become more and more of an information-based economy. Well, all that being said, now we're over and we're looking at, and we're going to clean this down some more. We do some more substitutes. And here you can see we're just substituting. We're still using that. And since we've got this function and we kind of have an algorithm, all we'll do for each column is we'll just drag and drop down, and we'll continue stripping it down. Okay, and then we end up with some more. And there's our tweet. We've used all the substitutes. We've done all the work. And I think it's over here in H, or it's I, where we start to build the pieces of that tweet where we've stripped it all down. And he comes down, he does this for all 150. Okay. Now, this next thing he does is he says, okay, let's look at tweets that we know or we suspect are not about Mandrill. Now, before I do that, let me pop in and show you something, okay, that over here in the course, and I'll go back out of the files, and it's over here in these resources. I'll close that for a second. And up. I'm sorry, folks. Let me scroll myself up here. Now the module. And this has to do with type 1 and type 2 error. And find that. Where did I stick you here? I'll bet you in here somewhere. I thought I had that. I thought I'd loaded that up there for everybody. Okay. Just raise. Here we are. It's this. I apologize. It's this resource called Naive Bayes and Types of Error. And you recall back from statistics, okay, that we have type 1 and type 2 error. Type 1 error is when I believe when I say I've detected something, but I really haven't. Type 2 error is when I don't detect something, but it's really there. Now, this is kind of a harsh look at those types of things, but let's say, for example, that your doctor says, I think you may have cancer, okay? Well, which one would you be more interested in? Type 1 error or type 2 error? I'd be interested in type 2 error because if it's there, I want to find it and I want to treat it. If it's not there, okay, I want to know that. So I get concerned more about type 2 error, that something will be missed. One of the reasons we do, we do vaccinations of people is because of type 2 error. When we say, well, the child looks normal, and then 3 weeks later, she's got smallpox, and everybody in the family is infected. And one of the strange things we're seeing happen in our country is with a lot of this stuff, that's the anti-vaccination movement that's out there. And I understand there are people who believe in it. They've studied all that stuff. But what we're finding is the reoccurrence of stuff that was out there when I was a child. And I can tell you, when I was a little boy, my mother was so frightened of polio that when August 1st came, the pools were out of the question. You didn't swim because there was a belief that kids who swam at the end of the summer had a higher risk of getting polio. Okay, and then there was smallpox, not as bad in the United States, but polio was the big one. Several other things. Let's see. Smallpox, polio, several diseases. But if I were to roll up my sleeve and show you my pin-marked arm, where when I was marched off to the elementary school, with 1,000 other people, and they took a little cylinder, and it had 6 little pricks, and they jammed that thing in your shoulder. And you're 5 years old, you tend to react. And then I remember, I think the last time I went through a mass vaccination was some kind of flu influenza. Ford was President Ford, and he urged everybody to take it. I go get flu shots now, and it's a little different as an adult, but you use the vaccine so you don't worry about the issue of, well, I had it but I didn't know it. That's a public health people. That's their nightmare. And I like to remind everybody that if you think we're that modern in this world we live today, we're about in the same situation as the people who were in medieval times, who had the Black Death, which ended up killing 1/3 of the entire population in Europe. That's a lot of people. And if you read the accounts of it, it's just unreal. But what happened was the Black Death was taken from Asia into Europe through trade. The rats that got aboard the ships in Asia came over to Europe. They docked, they got out, and that chain of events that happens started to occur, and then we had the Black Death. And the accounts of it are, oh my Lord, they just make your head, you go, thank God I wasn't born in that time. But today, with people flying around airplanes all over the world, going cities, global travel, we have to be careful about those kinds of things, because easily somebody in one country who is a carrier of some virus that we can't deal with becomes an issue. Well, here I walk you through that whole process of looking at true versus false, whether the proposition is true, okay, and we have type 1 error, and that's a false positive, okay, and this would be for them the situation where too many tweets are classified as app tweets. In other words, they let too many through, so they're not all just about the app. That's a type 1 error. Then we'd have a type 2 error where we take too many, where we have too many users, or probably too many tweets that are classified as non-app. That's the other end of the spectrum. And then we've got the true negative and the true positive. Now, a traditional according to traditional probabilistic theory, okay, we would assign probabilities to each of these quadrants. They'll all have to add up to 1, but we assume that we have enough data to know what we're looking at. And then when we do a statistical test, we can set a proper error. When you did statistics, you might have run you might have done maybe a t-test. And then you had to go and look at what that t-test value was and see how rare it was. Okay, and that's more of a traditional. The Bayesian says, I'm going to assume that everything's a 50-50 proposition. Okay, and it's a shortcut, and admittedly so, but that's why they do it. So I wanted to give you the background of that so you're going to stand out. You say, well, Dr. Harmon, I could care less about tweets. But let me say something. This model works whether you're talking about tweets or you're talking about your competitors' intention. For example, the proposition, my competitor is about to raise their prices. I don't know for sure, but I think they might. If they raise their price, okay, I may pick up some of their business, but I may be leaving some money on the table if, in whatever industry I am in, the switching cost is too high in the mind of the consumer. Okay. I can't tell you how many of my older relatives have called me about their phone plan, and they're just getting slaughtered. And the major impediment for them to change is, someone does the paperwork, I don't have to get out of the thing. And I'm going, okay, the cost of switching is too high for you. And so you could say, okay, are my competitors going to raise their prices or not? I could look at any one of a number of situations where I can use the truth table, okay, as a way to help me understand what I'm going to do. Now, I'll tell you a very interesting story out of military history. Probably nearly all of you have heard of the Battle of Bastogne, the battle, what they call the Battle of the Bulge. Bastogne is a town that was at a central it was in a central communications and travel node. It was right where several highways and roads ran through it, telephone lines, etc. And the Germans decided to go through the forest that was near that town and take a massive effort. And once they took the town, their plan was to use what we know they refer to as the Blitz, to go south and split the Allied armies in two, and then try to figure and capture Paris and make the Allies come to the table, because Germans knew they were losing. Now, the commander who was there, who was asked to surrender, and his famous reply to the Germans was nuts. And that was when the Germans said, well, we're going to annihilate you. Well, there's an interesting thing that he understood about that town. And he understood that the way into that town was about 4 or 5 different roads with bridges. And those bridges were a little bit too small for the German tanks to go through. So he knew the Germans were going to have to find a way to get across if they wanted to bring their tanks to go in for an assault in the city. And the Germans' philosophy of city assault was just go in and blow everything up and then send troops in, but blow it all up. Well, it also provided for the Americans, the airborne people who were there, who were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. But when the Germans would come into one of those compressed places, they were inside of a killing field, and so they would mount an assault, and they'd get repelled. It never occurred to the German general, why don't I try attacking them at 3 or 4 different places? Because the German philosophy or doctrine was you concentrate your forces, you achieve the objective and move on. You don't ever spread your forces. Allies had a completely different approach. They typically they'd have a line as far as the eye could see. The only time the Germans ever used a doctrine of attacking at all points was when they invaded Russia, and that didn't go so well. And the reason it didn't is they stopped at Stalingrad, and rather than just bypass the place, Hitler needed his ego stroked, so he decided he'd fight it out. And what happened was the Russian winter. Napoleon found out the Russian winter is a bad thing too. So the commander there in Bastogne said, I'll work the probabilities out. And I know there's 4 or 5 different entrances. I don't know which one, but I will hear them coming. And so we'll focus our force. So although we had a smaller force, the enemy had a compressed place where they could go. So they basically were in a killing field. And what they also didn't count on was that the Allied troops there, the Allied troops throughout Europe, were very frightened of German tanks. The Panzer tank was the finest tank that was ever produced. It was probably in the 70s or 80s, it'd still be good. But to make a long story short, they pioneered the use of what we call improvised explosive devices, IEDs. And they'd find a way to blow up the track on a tank. When you blow up the track, the tank can't move. And if it can't move, you can kill it. If it moves, you're dead in the water. So the commanding officer there understood about truth tables. He understood about type 1 and type 2 error, and he understood also about probabilities. And that's how they held that town. Now, the Germans had artillery outside of the city, and they just kept bombarding it, and they kept sending more and more shells. And I guess it never dawned on them that people will just simply dig underground, and they'll find a way to escape it. And they also did not have concussive shells. Concussive shells from artillery they don't have as much explosive power. But what they do is they basically create a wave of energy that either knocks you over, or if you're too close, it's just going to tear you apart. So they were firing high explosives that weren't really doing too much good. Well, it's an interesting little side note there of history. You can't say you don't get it all here, but I wanted you to see that so you understood about naive Bayes and understood we assume the true and false, they're there's equiprobability. Okay, let's go back into this Excel sheet and take a look at it. Now, again, we see the about these tweets are about the other, and we know this. Remember, I said we're doing an ex post facto study. After the fact, if I want to understand how cancer of the colon kills people, then when someone dies from it, if they donate their body to science, people will come in and they'll do an autopsy, a post-mortem, and take a look to find out what was going on. And then they'll take patient history data and all kinds of things to try to understand, was this person predisposed? What was it in their background, their diet, etc., as they try to figure out. So we're saying, okay, we know these are not tweets about our product. Okay, not about mandrels. So it's junk, it's spam. Okay, and so we start to clean it up, and this is just simply we're cleaning the data up. If you ever go out and maybe in stat, maybe one of the profs over there when you took your stat class here or somewhere else said, now what we want to do is we want to take the outliers and we'll forget about them. Okay, we'll just forget about them. Well, it makes for a nice statistical picture, but what it might not do is give you the full picture in terms of what really happened there, what the data are trying to tell you. And that's why I think in either in this class or I know for sure in the business problem analysis class, I showed you about Anscombe's quartet. And you can go out and I've got 3, or you can go to the web, and look on it for Anscombe, Anscombe quartet. Here's the deal. Anscombe, this is from a 1973 article in American Statistician. But what Anscombe said was our ability to compute data is far outstripping our ability to visualize data. And human beings are visual creatures first. And we learn from patterns and designs. We learn with pictures, okay? And so if we're going to present data, we need to make sure that it's presented properly. And those who've taken BPA with me, I have the Stephen Few text where we talk about, show me the money. And it's not a week goes by that I don't see somebody who has a bar graph where everything adds up to more than to 100% and just all types of sins. So we want to do some work with these data and strip them down so we can analyze them properly, okay? And that's a big challenge, but it's also visualizing and putting those data into some type of visualization so I can see them. And that, again, is another one of those challenges. And as you move forward through your career, all of you, to one extent or the other, are going to be working with these things called dashboards. And a dashboard is very simply two things. One, it's some type of form that provides you access to a data warehouse. Now we have data lakes, okay? And data lakes are unstructured data plus the data warehouse. But basically you'll have some applications, or you'll have some links to some things that are part of what we call your KPI, your key performance indicators. And you'll click on them to see how you're doing. And if you go to Walmart, for example, and you walk in the back, you'll see they have a little sign that says today's stock price is. As a reminder to the employees, if you're in the profit sharing game with us, or you're putting your money into Walmart, and if you're working for them on the floor, I don't think you're getting too many big stock options. But it's a way to say to everybody, here's how we're doing, okay? And everybody has will have a key performance indicator. We're moving to that today. And I've told the story before that when I go in and I work with somebody on their database, I ask them, what are the 5 things you need to know every single day about your organization? And it makes them go crazy. There's more than that. No, there's usually about 4 or 5 metrics that help you determine what's going on. Now, here we're doing some more. Again, we're cleaning these data up, okay? And then we end up with the cleaned up tweet. Now, we get these things called app tokens. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, since we're working with non-numbers, we can still count them. So we're going to make sure that we get some type of measure that's not just a simple count, but is interval in nature. If you remember back from stat again, you had nominal, categorical data, stuff I can count. I had ordinal data, greater than, lesser than. I had interval data, which is stuff that is equally and infinitely divisible. And then I had ratio data that I have an absolute 0. So we want to find a way to count these, okay? But we also want to find a way to qualify them or bring some type of interval measure into them. And so, as is the case with most text analyses, we say, okay, let's look at the length. And what's going on here with these app tokens is very simply, we're starting with a space position, and we're going to look and see the length of our tweet and the token. And we're going to use, and I explained this to you I've got a handout there for you to take a look at. And we use the value if error function, okay? And if you want to see some more about that, I've got a handout there for you to take a look at. And you can go over to to Microsoft Office, Easy Excel, or a lot of places that will walk you through that, the if error function. And what we've got here is we're going to use the if error function, and then we've got embedded in it the mid function, and then we have our token. All right. And if that and if we don't find that, then we put a dot, quotes dot quote, and that's the end of that story, and that's what we get. Okay. Now we use that next, okay, to get the length, and that len is just simply the length. And what we're assuming is the longer the length of this, the more we tend to believe that it's about the product. But we want to get these links. So if you scroll down, now I know I'm going through this broad brush. Listen, we could spend the whole semester on this. So I want to let you see it. And you can see to get the length, we use the if error, okay, to get the length to determine the starting position. So I'll go back up to tweet number 1, and notice we start there. It's at the length that we have to have a starting position of 0, and watch what's going to happen. We'll come down. Now, once we've counted a certain number of spaces, we move on over, and it just becomes a series of iterations. That's all that's going on here. The 0. But the 0 position, we start to come across, and we say, okay, we started and we counted this position. This is 0. Then we move, and this is 0, etc. As we break that down to get the length. And like I said, I have several handouts there that will walk you through in excruciating detail exactly what's going on here. Okay? But we're creating our tokens. In other words, those that we believe are about the app. And we get the length. Now, once we've computed the length, then I'll come on down here. Because we're gonna have to do this. We have 150 tweets. Okay, but as we begin to break them down, you start to see we get more and more sub-records. Okay, I'll come down to the very bottom of that. We end up at 4,500. Because remember, we've got 150 tweets, and we're going to look at each segment of them, so we're going to end up with 4,500 records. And then we get the length. And there's the space position, and there's the token. And that token is exactly what it says. It's like a chip, a token that represents something. Okay, that's all. And so we have the space position 119, and then we've got the length. Now we do the same thing with the others. Same process, same functions. Okay. And we're going to walk right through that, and we'll come down. We'll have 4,500 of those as well. And notice the token. It's a dot, and like a little placeholder, and we get the lengths. Now, once we've done this, now we have something we can work with in terms of what one would call interval data. And so I want to show you this, and I'm going a little bit over time, and I apologize that. And those of you here, if you have to go to class, go ahead. If not, because I'm going to finish this up. But I'm going to click on the app tokens probability. Okay, and so we have these row labels. Now we're going to normalize these data by adding 1 to them, for the very simple reason that we're going to get such low probabilities that we need to bring them up to a level. So we're going to use the len, okay, that len, the len function, and we'll calculate the probability. Notice we're dividing C5, okay, by C828, which is our total. So we get that percentage, and then we turn this into a workable number. And we'll talk some more about this. I think this is probably a good time to stop because I can finish this up and we can talk about single arbitrary. Again, this is chapter 3 in the Data Smart textbook, and it's all. And also, I want you to take a look over there at the single arbitrary. And I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's chapter 11 in the Anderson text. I think it's either 11 or 13. I think it's 11, and it covers the. We're gonna start to put weight into the water of queuing line theory. Well, thank you so much, folks, and those of you who are out there, you as well. And we'll see you on Wednesday. I guess before I stop this, does anybody have anything? Anybody have any questions I could try to answer for you? In here or out there? No. This is like drinking out of a fire hydrant, isn't it? That's you'll have to it's why you need to take a look at the book, and that's okay, because it's once you've gone through it and you've had the time to digest it, then you really it's